Claire Ashton sat in the stillness of her pristine apartment, the polished surfaces gleaming under the soft overhead lights. Every detail of her home was meticulously designed, a reflection of her professional success as an interior designer. She had made a name for herself in the world of modern aesthetics, crafting spaces that earned her recognition in prestigious design magazines. To the outside world, Claire was the picture of accomplishment, a woman in her late 30s with a flourishing career, a sleek, stylish lifestyle, and a home that echoed her mastery of control. But control, Claire knew, was a facade. Her carefully curated life could not hide the truth of the deep, festering emptiness inside her. The success she had built, the relationships she had maintained from a comfortable distance, and the endless string of accolades, none of it could fill the void left by a single day that changed her life 20 years ago. A day that had shaped every decision since. The day Emily died. Emily wasn't just a friend to Claire. She was her everything. The two girls had grown up together in a small suburban town, spending long summer days, whispering secrets and dreams beneath the towering oak trees in Claire's backyard. They had been inseparable, tied together not just by proximity, but by an unspoken bond, solidified by matching silver bracelets they had exchanged on Emily's 10th birthday. Claire could still feel the weight of that bracelet on her wrist, a symbol of their unbreakable promise: we'll always be together. But that promise shattered the night Emily died in a car accident. It was an event so sudden, so inexplicable, that it felt more like a bad dream than reality. One moment, Emily was there, vibrant and full of life, with her laugh that lit up a room. The next, she was gone. Claire remembered standing at the edge of the crash site, the wreckage smoldering as rain poured down, her heart hammering as she searched for anything to make sense of the chaos. Then she saw it. Lying among the debris, blood-spattered and broken, was Emily's bracelet, the same one Claire wore, now symbolizing an unbearable loss. For 2 decades, Claire had buried her grief deep inside her, never allowing herself to confront the pain. Instead, she pushed forward. She became the perfect version of what she thought Emily would want her to be: strong, composed, successful. But in doing so, she cut herself off from truly living. Every relationship she had tried to form since had failed. Not because the people weren't right, but because she wasn't present. How could she be? Part of her had died with Emily, and she wasn't sure if she could ever reclaim it. Claire's friends, co-workers, and even her family didn't know this part of her. To them, she was an enigma, warm enough to be liked, distant enough to remain unknowable. It was easier that way. Easier to avoid questions that might pry open the wound she had so carefully stitched closed. But even the most expertly hidden scars could start to ache, especially around the anniversary of the accident. And now, as that date crept closer, the weight of her suppressed grief pressed down on her chest like a stone. It had been years since she visited Emily's grave, too afraid to face the finality of it all. Her family had drifted apart after Emily's death, their shared sorrow splintering into silence. Claire had stopped reaching out, isolating herself from anyone who might remind her of what she had lost. And yet, every October, like clockwork, the memories came flooding back, bringing with them the familiar heaviness. Emily's voice, her face, the bracelet, the wreckage, it all haunted her, no matter how hard she tried to push it away. Claire's days now consisted of endless meetings with clients, the hum of her phone constantly vibrating with emails and notifications, and magazine features showcasing her latest designs. Her colleagues praised her talent, and her clients adored her work, but Claire never let them in. She performed her role flawlessly, but always with a certain distance, never lingering too long, never allowing anyone to see the vulnerable parts of her. It was a pattern she had perfected over the years. Her achievements felt hollow, like ornaments on a Christmas tree, beautiful to look at but ultimately empty inside. Her life had become a series of routines, all designed to keep her too busy to think about what truly mattered. But despite her efforts, Emily's memory loomed over her, a silent shadow that refused to be ignored. As the anniversary of Emily's death approached once again, Claire felt the familiar tightness in her chest, but she pushed it aside. She had work to do, projects to complete, deadlines to meet. There was no time to indulge in memories, but deep down, Claire knew that no matter how much she tried to suppress it, Emily's death was the wound that had never healed. It was the silent core of her existence, shaping every choice, every moment, and every empty connection she had forged since that tragic day. Tonight, Claire sat on her pristine couch, staring at the glass of wine in her hand, watching the crimson liquid swirl under the light. She could hear the faint hum of the city outside, cars passing, people laughing, life moving on. But here, in the quiet of her apartment, time felt suspended, as though she was still stuck in that moment, standing in the rain, staring at the wreckage. She took a slow sip, the wine bitter against her tongue. She had learned to carry the weight of her grief, to function with it like an old injury. But it was always there, lurking beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to make itself known. And as much as she tried to ignore it, she couldn't shake the feeling that this year would be different. That something was coming, something she couldn't quite place but could already feel approaching like a distant storm. For now, though, she pushed those thoughts away and refocused on the project files scattered across her sleek coffee table. Work was her refuge, her distraction. As long as she kept busy, she could keep the past at bay. At least, that's what she told herself. And yet, as she glanced at her phone and saw the date flashing on the screen, Claire couldn't stop the flood of memories that surged forward. Emily's laugh, her bracelet, the promise they had made to each other. Always together. Claire closed her eyes, fighting against the wave of emotions. But some things couldn't be buried forever. The storm was coming, and soon she would have no choice but to face it. The autumn evening was brisk as Claire walked home from work, the city bathed in the soft glow of fading sunlight. The streets were alive with people hurrying to their destinations, wrapped in coats and scarves, their breath visible in the cool air. Normally, Claire relished this part of her day. The walk home provided a brief respite from the endless demands of her job, a few precious moments where she could blend into the anonymity of the city. She could clear her mind, or at least try to, before returning to the solitude of her apartment. But today, the walk felt different. The sense of unease that had been gnawing at her for weeks now seemed to thrum just beneath her skin, making her hyper-aware of everything around her. The sound of footsteps on the pavement, the faint echo of a distant siren, the muted conversations of passers-by. Her mind was heavy with thoughts of Emily, as it often was this time of year, and no matter how much she tried to push those memories down, they kept rising to the surface. As Claire neared a bustling intersection, her eyes were drawn to a figure sitting on the sidewalk, hunched over a worn-out cardboard sign. A young woman, probably in her 20s, with tangled hair that framed a tired, gaunt face. Her clothes were rumpled, a few sizes too big, and she sat cross-legged on a fraying blanket. The sight wasn't uncommon in the city, where the contrast between wealth and poverty often clashed on the same street corner. Normally, Claire would pass by, her thoughts too preoccupied to linger. But today, something stopped her. The woman's eyes were downcast, but there was something familiar in the curve of her cheek, the slight tilt of her head. Claire couldn't place it, but a strange, inexplicable pull drew her closer. Without thinking, Claire reached into her bag and fumbled for her wallet, pulling out a few bills. She crouched down to offer them to the woman. As she extended her hand, something glinted in the fading light, catching Claire's eye. Her heart gave a jarring, uneven thump. There, on the woman's wrist, was a silver bracelet. That bracelet. The same bracelet Emily had given her all those years ago. The same bracelet she had found among the wreckage, bloodied and twisted after Emily's accident. The sight of it now, worn by this stranger on the street, sent a shock through Claire's entire body. The bracelet was simple, a thin silver band with a delicate charm, an intricate tree engraved with their initials. Claire's breath caught in her throat, her vision narrowing on the piece of jewelry as if the world around her had fallen away. For a moment, it was like she was back in that rain-soaked street, staring at the mangled remains of the car, the bracelet lying in the mud. The air seemed to thicken around her, making it hard to breathe. "Ma'am?" The woman's voice was soft, almost hesitant, as she looked up and met Claire's gaze. Claire blinked, startled out of her trance. She realized she had been staring, her hand frozen in midair. She quickly handed over the money, her fingers trembling slightly as they brushed against the woman's. The skin-on-skin contact jolted her, and for the briefest moment, Claire felt something. Recognition? "Thank you," the woman said quietly, her voice hoarse but sincere. Claire stood there, unable to speak, her eyes fixed on the bracelet. How was this possible? That bracelet had been lost, destroyed. She had seen it with her own eyes, broken and mangled in the wreckage. And yet, here it was, perfectly intact, on the wrist of a stranger. The woman shifted uncomfortably under Claire's scrutiny, pulling her sleeve down slightly to cover the bracelet, as if sensing Claire's sudden discomfort. You have a beautiful bracelet," Claire finally managed to say, her voice sounding distant, almost robotic. The woman glanced down at her wrist and gave a faint, tired smile. "Yeah, it was a gift," she said softly. "From someone important." Claire felt her stomach twist. She wanted to ask more, to press for answers, but her mouth was dry, her thoughts a chaotic jumble. Instead, she reached into her bag again, pulling out a small sandwich she had bought earlier, not sure what else to do. "Here," she offered, her hand shaking slightly as she held it out. The woman's eyes softened in surprise and she accepted the sandwich with a grateful nod. "Thank you," she said again, this time with a little more warmth in her voice. For a moment their eyes met, and Claire felt a strange rush of emotion she couldn't name. It wasn't just sympathy, it was something deeper, something that stirred an old, dormant ache inside her. A connection, maybe, or a fleeting sense of déjà vu. She didn't understand it, but it left her feeling unsettled. I should go," Claire murmured, stepping back, her heart still racing. The woman nodded, offering a quiet goodbye as Claire turned and walked away, her legs shaky beneath her. She didn't look back, but her mind was spinning. Her pulse thrummed in her ears as the city streets blurred around her, the bracelet flashing in her mind over and over again. By the time she reached her apartment, Claire's thoughts were a tangled mess. She threw her keys onto the counter and sank onto the couch, her mind still reeling from the encounter. She couldn't shake the image of the woman's face, her eyes tired but familiar. And that bracelet? How could it be? As the night wore on, Claire's mind kept circling back to the past, to Emily. The dreams came swiftly when she finally drifted off, pulling her back to that time they had exchanged bracelets. She could still see Emily's face, her smile bright as they made their promise to each other. "We'll always be together." The words echoed in Claire's mind, mingling with the memory of the accident, the wreckage, the sight of the bracelet lying broken on the ground. When she awoke, her heart was heavy, her grief raw and exposed in a way it hadn't been in years. For the first time in a long time, Claire allowed herself to feel the weight of it, to confront the deep, aching loss she had spent 2 decades trying to ignore. But now, with the image of that stranger's bracelet burned into her mind, Claire couldn't escape the questions. How could something from her past, something that was supposed to be gone forever, reappear in such an unexpected way? And who was that woman? The next morning, Claire awoke feeling a heavy weight on her chest, as though the dream of Emily still clung to her like a dense fog. She tried to shake off the strange encounter from the previous night, but the image of the bracelet and the homeless woman's face followed her through the day like a shadow. Work, normally her refuge, offered no distraction. Her mind was in constant motion, retracing every moment of that brief exchange, trying to find an explanation that made sense. By late afternoon, Claire found herself standing at the window of her office, staring blankly at the bustling city below. The hum of her coworkers and the ringing phones around her felt distant, muffled by the growing sense of unease that had lodged itself in her chest. She knew she couldn't let it go. Not this time. There was something she needed to confront, something buried deep in her past that was clawing its way back to the surface. Before she knew it, Claire had packed up her things and was walking briskly through the lobby, her heels clicking loudly on the marble floor. The impulse to move, to do something, had taken over, and she didn't resist it. Her destination became clear as she stepped out onto the street. The cemetery. It had been years since she last visited Emily's grave. Guilt, mixed with the deep pain of loss, had kept her away, and each passing year had only made it harder to return. But now, with the unsettling encounter still fresh in her mind, Claire knew she had to go. She needed answers, or maybe just a way to quiet the storm of emotions that had been stirred up inside her. The cemetery was a 30-minute drive from her office, a quiet place nestled at the edge of the city where the noise and chaos of urban life gave way to a calm stillness. As Claire approached the entrance, her heart began to race, the familiar knot of grief tightening in her chest. She parked the car and sat for a moment, her fingers gripping the steering wheel, unsure if she was ready to face this. But something propelled her forward, something beyond rational thought. Perhaps the memory of that bracelet, or the nagging feeling that she was on the verge of discovering something important. She stepped out of the car, the cool October air brushing against her skin, and made her way through the gates. The path to Emily's grave was overgrown, the grass wet with morning dew, as though time had forgotten this place in the same way Claire had tried to forget her own past. Her footsteps were slow, hesitant, but with each step, her resolve grew stronger. She needed to see it, to see her. As Claire rounded the familiar corner and approached Emily's headstone, she froze. There, standing before the grave, was the same young woman from the street, the bracelet glinting on her wrist in the afternoon sunlight. Claire's breath caught in her throat, her mind reeling. What was she doing here? How could this be a coincidence? For a long moment, Claire stood there, unable to move, her heart pounding in her ears. The woman hadn't noticed her yet, her eyes fixed on Emily's grave as though lost in thought. There was a stillness about her, an air of quiet contemplation that made Claire hesitate. But the shock and confusion of seeing her again pushed Claire forward, her feet moving of their own accord until she was standing just a few feet away. "You?" Claire breathed, the words slipping out before she could stop herself. The woman looked up, her expression shifting from surprise to something softer, almost expectant. She didn't seem startled to see Claire, as though she had been waiting for this moment. I didn't expect to see you here," Claire stammered, her voice shaky, unsure how to begin. The woman smiled faintly, her eyes flickering with recognition. "I didn't expect to see you either," she replied. Her voice calm, but tinged with something Claire couldn't quite place. Familiarity? Sadness? Claire's eyes dropped to the bracelet on the woman's wrist, the same knot of emotions tightening in her chest. "That bracelet," Claire whispered, the words barely audible over the sound of the wind rustling through the trees. It was my friend's, Emily's." The woman glanced down at her wrist, then back up at Claire. "It belonged to my aunt," she said simply, as though it were the most natural thing in the world. Claire blinked, her mind stumbling over the words. "Aunt?" The world seemed to tilt on its axis, everything she thought she knew slipping out of focus. "Your aunt?" she echoed, confusion coloring her voice. "But Emily didn't have a sister." The woman tilted her head slightly, a faint smile tugging at the corners of her mouth, though her eyes remained somber. "She did," she said softly. "She just never told you." Claire took a step back, her heart racing, her mind struggling to catch up with the enormity of what she had just heard. Emily had a sister? But how? How could she not have known? She and Emily had been inseparable, sharing every detail of their lives, every secret. Or so she had thought. The betrayal stung like a fresh wound. "I don't understand," Claire said, shaking her head as if that could clear the fog of disbelief clouding her mind. "Why wouldn't she tell me?" The woman, Leela, she introduced herself, lowered her gaze, her voice soft and full of something that sounded like empathy. "It was complicated," she explained. "My mother and Emily, they didn't get along. Emily didn't want to burden you with her family problems. She wanted to protect you from all that." Claire stared at her, the weight of the revelation pressing down on her like a physical force. Memories of her and Emily flashed before her eyes. Days spent laughing, sharing dreams, promising to always be there for each other. But now those memories felt fractured, incomplete, as though there had always been a part of Emily's life that Claire had been shut out from. "Why are you here?" Claire asked, her voice barely a whisper, her emotions a swirling mess of confusion, anger, and heartbreak. "Why now?" Lila looked at the grave, her expression thoughtful. "I didn't know much about Emily growing up," she admitted. "My mom kept her distant from that part of the family. But after my mom passed, I found some old letters Emily had written to her. I've been trying to piece together who my aunt really was, and that led me here. To you." Claire's throat tightened, her mind struggling to process the flood of information. Emily had kept so much from her, not out of cruelty, but out of some misguided attempt to protect her. But now, standing here, Claire didn't know whether to feel betrayed or heartbroken. "You're wearing her bracelet," Claire said, her voice cracking as she stared at the delicate silver band that had once symbolized her deepest friendship. "How?" Lila looked down at the bracelet, running her fingers over the charm. "It was passed down to me," she said quietly. "I think she would have wanted you to have it back." For a moment they stood in silence, the weight of the past hanging between them like a heavy fog. Claire felt her heart constrict, the pain of loss mixed with the realization that there was so much she hadn't known, so much she had been shielded from. But now, standing here, she wasn't sure if she was ready to confront the truth. All she knew was that everything she thought she understood about Emily, about their friendship, had just shifted in a way that left her feeling more lost than ever before. The days that followed were a blur for Claire. She moved through them in a haze, her mind replaying her encounter with Lila over and over again, the shock of the revelation. Emily's secret sister, the existence of an entire part of Emily's life that Claire had never known, was like a wound reopening, one that she thought had long since scarred over. And now, with the discovery of Lila and the mystery of the bracelet, that wound was raw, bleeding anew. The grief that Claire had buried so deep resurfaced with a vengeance, but now it was tangled with something darker, something she hadn't anticipated. Betrayal. How could Emily have kept something so monumental from her? They had been inseparable. Hadn't they shared everything? How could Emily have faced whatever turmoil existed within her family and never once confided in Claire? The questions churned in Claire's mind, keeping her awake at night, haunting her every waking moment. She felt lost, adrift in a sea of memories that now felt tainted. For years, she had idolized Emily, clung to the image of her best friend as the one constant in a world that had become too cold and unpredictable after her death. But now that image was fractured. It wasn't the Emily she had lost, it was the Emily she had never known. Claire's apartment, usually a sanctuary of order and control, now felt suffocating. She couldn't focus on work, couldn't think about design meetings or deadlines. Every corner of her mind was consumed by this new, painful knowledge. She sat for hours at her desk, staring at the same files without making any progress. Her coworkers started to notice her absence, her clients began to sense her distraction, but Claire didn't care. Her world was unraveling, and she didn't know how to stop it. On the third sleepless night, Claire did something she hadn't done in years. She pulled out the box. It had been tucked away in the back of her closet for nearly 2 decades, buried under layers of forgotten things, untouched since Emily's funeral. Claire had avoided it all this time, afraid of what it might stir in her. But now, with the storm of emotions raging inside her, she felt drawn to it, compelled to face what she had long avoided. The box was small, unassuming, but inside it were pieces of her past that she had once cherished. Letters Emily had written her over the years, photos of the two of them at summer camp, movie ticket stubs from their teenage years, and the matching bracelet Claire had worn until the day of the accident. The sight of it now, a silver band identical to the one Lila had worn, made Claire's chest tighten painfully. She held the bracelet in her hands, the cool metal pressing into her palm, and she remembered the day Emily had given it to her. "We'll always be together," Emily had said, her eyes shining with that fierce, unbreakable bond that only children believe can last forever. But that bond had broken, hadn't it? Claire had been left behind, and now it seemed there were pieces of Emily's life she had never been allowed to touch. Claire dug deeper into the box, pulling out old letters and postcards, each one filled with Emily's familiar handwriting, so vibrant, so alive. But as she read through them, something strange began to happen. She started to notice small details, things she had glossed over before, subtle hints that Emily had been dealing with more than she had let on. One letter, written during their junior year of high school, stood out. Emily had mentioned her mother in passing, saying she was stressed about family stuff. Claire had thought nothing of it at the time. It was typical teenage banter, the kind of thing they had laughed off. But now, in light of what Lila had told her, those words seemed heavier, loaded with a meaning Claire hadn't grasped before. Family stuff. Was that a reference to Lila? To the sister Emily had kept hidden from her? Another letter, written just a few months before the accident, was even more cryptic. Emily had been unusually distant in that one, talking about feeling overwhelmed, like she had too many things on her plate. Claire had asked her about it back then, but Emily had brushed it off, saying it was just school pressure. Now Claire wondered if that had been a lie. Was Emily trying to protect her from something bigger? The more Claire read, the more fragmented her memories of Emily became. There had been signs, hadn't there? Small cracks in the perfect picture of their friendship, cracks that Claire had been too blind or too naive to see. And now, with those letters spread out before her, Claire felt the weight of that realization crushing her. The guilt hit her like a wave. How could she have been so self-absorbed, so wrapped up in her own grief after Emily's death, that she never questioned what might have been going on in her best friend's life before the accident? Emily had kept so much from her, yes, but maybe that was because Claire had never really asked the right questions. Maybe Emily had been protecting her, or maybe she had been too afraid to let Claire see the messiness of her own family. Claire closed her eyes, her fingers tightening around the bracelet. The betrayal she had felt was still there, but now it was mixed with something else. A deep, aching sadness. Emily had carried so much on her own, and Claire had never noticed. She had been too focused on the idyllic version of their friendship, too content to believe that their bond had been unbreakable. But it wasn't unbreakable. It had broken. And now, Claire was left with the pieces. The next morning, Claire made a decision. She couldn't live with this uncertainty, this half-knowledge of who Emily had really been. She needed answers, and she knew where to start. Lila had mentioned letters Emily had written to her sister. If there was any chance of understanding why Emily had kept this part of her life hidden, those letters would hold the key. Claire called Lila, her heart pounding as the phone rang, unsure if she was ready to confront the truth, but knowing she couldn't turn back now. When Lila answered, there was a softness in her voice as if she had expected Claire's call. "I need to know more," Claire said, her voice steady but thick with emotion. "About Emily, about your mother. I need to understand why she never told me." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and then Lila sighed, her voice gentle. "I can show you the letters," she said. "But, Claire, you need to know, it wasn't because she didn't love you. Emily kept things from a lot of people. My mom, they had a complicated relationship." Claire's throat tightened. She nodded, even though Lila couldn't see her. "I want to see them," she whispered. They arranged to meet later that day. Claire hung up, her mind buzzing with the thought of what she might uncover. She wasn't sure if she was ready to face whatever truths those letters held, but she knew she couldn't continue living in this fog of uncertainty. She needed to understand the real Emily, the one who had carried burdens Claire had never been aware of. Later that afternoon, Claire found herself sitting across from Lila in a quiet cafe. A stack of letters sat between them, thick and worn with age, their faded envelopes holding the answers Claire had been seeking. As she picked up the first one, her hands trembling, she took a deep breath, preparing herself for whatever revelations were about to unfold. Claire's hands trembled as she opened the first letter, the paper soft from years of handling. The words, written in Emily's familiar cursive, felt both intimate and foreign, as if they belonged to someone else entirely. Lila sat across from her, quiet and patient, giving Claire the space to absorb the contents of the letter. Each line peeled back layers of Emily's life that Claire had never known, revealing a person who had been struggling beneath the surface, while maintaining a brave face for those around her. The letters between Emily and her sister, Lila's mother, were filled with tension, complicated emotions, and unspoken wounds. Claire learned that the relationship between the two sisters had always been strained, marked by jealousy, misunderstandings, and a deep-seated rivalry that had begun in their childhood. Emily had distanced herself from her sister, not wanting to drag Claire into the complicated dynamics of her family life. The letters spoke of guilt and regret, Emily's desire to protect Claire from that pain, to keep their friendship as pure and untouched as it had always been. In one of the letters, Emily wrote about how much she valued Claire. how she didn't want her to see the messiness of her home life. "Claire doesn't need to know about any of this. She's my safe place, my refuge," Emily had written. The words felt like a stab to Claire's heart, equal parts comforting and devastating. She had been Emily's safe haven, but at the cost of knowing the full truth. It explained so much, but it also left Claire with an ache of sadness that her best friend had carried so much without ever asking for help. As she read through the final letters, Claire's anger at Emily for keeping these secrets began to dissipate, replaced by a deep sense of empathy. Emily hadn't kept things from her out of distrust or deceit. She had done it out of love, trying to shield Claire from the pain she herself had been carrying. And yet, in doing so, Emily had unintentionally created a barrier between them, a wall that Claire hadn't even known existed until now. By the time Claire finished the last letter, tears blurred her vision. She set the papers down, wiping her eyes, overwhelmed by the weight of what she had learned. Across from her, Lila watched in quiet understanding, her own emotions visible in the soft downturn of her lips. "It wasn't your fault," Lila said gently, as if sensing the turmoil inside Claire. "Emily, she didn't know how to ask for help. She didn't want to burden you." Claire nodded, her throat tight. "I just wish I had known. I wish I could have been there for her." Lila reached out, her hand resting on Claire's. "You were there for her, in the ways she needed. She just couldn't bring herself to share everything. It wasn't about you. It was about her need to protect what you two had." Claire squeezed Lila's hand, grateful for her kindness, for the connection they were beginning to build. This young woman, Emily's niece, was now the link between Claire and the best friend she had lost. And Claire realized with a bittersweet clarity that maybe this wasn't about trying to reconcile with the past, but about creating something new, something that could help both of them heal. "I'm sorry I didn't know about you," Claire said quietly, her voice filled with regret. "I should have known more about Emily's life. I thought I knew everything, but—" Lila smiled softly. "It's not your fault. My mom kept me away from all of it, and Emily, well, she did the same to you. I'm just glad we found each other now." Claire felt a warmth in her chest, a small but growing light in the darkness she had been carrying for so long. There was no undoing the past, no bringing Emily back. But there was a chance for something different, a chance to find closure, not just for herself, but for Lila too. In the days that followed, Claire and Lila began to spend more time together. Their conversations, which had started cautiously, grew deeper, more honest. Lila opened up about her own struggles, how she had spent years feeling like she didn't belong, disconnected from her mother's side of the family, never knowing her Aunt Emily except through stories and photographs. Lila had always felt a strange emptiness, like she was missing a piece of her own history. And it wasn't until she found the letters that she began to understand who Emily had been and how much she had meant to so many people. For Claire, these conversations brought a kind of healing she hadn't expected. Lila became a bridge to Emily's memory, but not in the painful way Claire had feared. Instead, Lila represented a new connection, someone who shared a bond with Emily, but who also needed Claire in a different, more present way. The more they talked, the more Claire realized that Lila wasn't just a reminder of what she had lost. She was an opportunity to forge something meaningful in the present. One afternoon, as they sat together in a quiet park, Lila brought up an idea that Claire hadn't considered. "Do you think we could go there?" Lila asked, her voice hesitant. "Go where?" Claire replied, tilting her head in curiosity. "The cabin," Lila said softly. "The one you and Emily used to go to. You've told me so much about it. I'd like to see it, to understand that part of her life." The suggestion made Claire pause. The cabin had been their sanctuary, a small, rustic retreat by the lake where she and Emily had spent countless summers, far from the complications of family and the pressures of school. It was a place filled with memories, both joyful and bittersweet. Claire hadn't returned there since Emily's death, too afraid of the emotions it might stir. But now, with Lila beside her, the idea didn't seem as overwhelming. "Yeah," Claire said after a moment, her voice soft but certain. "I think it's time we go." The drive to the cabin was long, winding through roads that grew narrower the further they got from the city. Claire felt a mixture of nerves and anticipation as they approached the familiar dirt path that led to the lake. The trees were turning shades of gold and orange, their leaves falling gently in the cool autumn breeze. The cabin looked almost exactly as Claire remembered it, weathered but standing, a relic of their childhood. As they stepped out of the car, Claire took a deep breath, the scent of pine and lake water filling her lungs. For the first time in years, the memories that flooded her weren't just tinged with sorrow. There was a softness to them now, a sense of peace that came from finally facing what she had been avoiding for so long. She and Lila spent the afternoon walking around the lake, talking about Emily, sharing stories, and reflecting on their own journeys of loss and healing. The sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the water, and Claire felt something lift inside her. Like the heavy burden she had carried for years was finally beginning to ease. Sitting by the water's edge, Lila looked at Claire, her eyes filled with quiet gratitude. "Thank you," she said, her voice gentle, "for sharing this with me, for helping me understand her." Claire smiled, feeling a warmth she hadn't felt in a long time. "Thank you for finding me," she replied, "for bringing her back to me in a way I didn't expect." In that moment, Claire realized that healing didn't mean forgetting. It didn't mean erasing the past or the pain of losing Emily. It meant embracing the love that still lingered, the memories that could bring comfort instead of only sorrow. Lila had given her a second chance at connection, at family, at love. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Claire and Lila sat together in silence, watching the light fade. The future stretched before them, uncertain but full of possibility, and for the first time in years, Claire felt ready to face it. The weeks that followed their visit to the cabin marked a subtle but profound change in Claire's life. For so long, she had lived with the weight of her unresolved grief, moving through the world as if she were a shadow of herself. But now there was a shift, a lightness she hadn't felt in years. It wasn't that the pain of losing Emily had disappeared. The grief would always be a part of her, but it had softened, transformed into something that no longer paralyzed her. The ache of Emily's absence had been replaced by a warmth, the memory of their friendship, now intertwined with the presence of Lila. Claire embraced her new role in Lila's life slowly at first, unsure of how much she could offer this young woman who had come to her in such an unexpected way. But the bond between them deepened with each conversation, with each shared memory. Claire found herself taking on a protective role, offering guidance and support where she could, but also learning from Lila about resilience, about the courage it took to seek out the truth, and about the strength that came from confronting the past rather than running from it. Lila, in turn, began to rely on Claire in ways that surprised them both. What started as a search for answers about her aunt soon evolved into a relationship that felt like something more. Claire wasn't just a connection to Emily anymore, she was becoming someone important in Lila's life. They spent more time together, talking about their hopes and dreams, their fears and uncertainties. Claire realized that, despite the difference in their ages, they had both been searching for something they hadn't even known they needed. One crisp autumn afternoon, Claire sat in her apartment, the sunlight streaming through the large windows, bathing the room in a golden glow. She looked around, realizing that for the first time in years, the quiet didn't feel lonely. She was preparing for Lila's visit later that day. They had plans to visit an art gallery downtown, something that had become a shared tradition. Lila had taken up photography, inspired by the places and people who had shaped her life, and Claire felt a deep sense of pride watching her explore this new passion. As Claire reached for her phone, a message from her estranged brother flashed on the screen. For years, Claire had kept her distance from her family, too afraid of the emotional entanglements that might come with reconciling. But the changes in her life, the growth she had experienced through her relationship with Lila, had made her rethink that decision. Slowly, she had begun to rebuild those bridges, reaching out to her family, letting go of the emotional barriers she had erected long ago. It wasn't easy, and the conversations were often awkward, but it was a start. And that, Claire had learned, was enough. There was a knock on the door, and when Claire opened it, Lila stood there, a wide smile on her face. She was holding a small, wrapped package, I got you something, Lila said, her eyes twinkling with excitement. Claire raised an eyebrow in surprise, taking the gift from Lila's hands. What's this for? Just open it, Lila insisted, grinning. Claire unwrapped the package carefully, revealing a delicate silver picture frame. Inside was a photograph Lila had taken on their trip to the cabin, of the lake at sunset, the water reflecting the warm colors of the sky, serene and beautiful. It was a perfect representation of the peace Claire had found that day. Tears welled in Claire's eyes as she looked at the photograph, her heart swelling with gratitude. Lila, it's beautiful, thank you. Lila smiled, her own eyes glistening with emotion. I wanted you to have something to remember that day by. It felt like the beginning of something new. Claire nodded, her throat tight with emotion. It was, she whispered, setting the frame down on the table. It really was. They left for the art gallery soon after, walking through the city streets together, the crisp autumn air invigorating. Claire couldn't help but feel a sense of hope as they wandered through the gallery, admiring the photographs that lined the walls. Lila was talking animatedly about a new project she was working on, an exhibition centered around the theme of loss and memory. Claire listened, her heart full as she realized how far they had both come. As they stood before one of the photographs, Lila turned to Claire, her voice soft but steady. You know, I've been thinking a lot about what Emily might have wanted, for both of us. Claire glanced at her, curiosity flickering in her eyes. What do you mean? Lila smiled, her gaze thoughtful. I think she'd want us to move forward, to live our lives fully, not to be stuck in the past. Claire nodded slowly, the weight of those words sinking in. I think you're right, she said, her voice quiet but filled with conviction. She would want that. For the first time in years, Claire felt like she was ready to do just that, to move forward. Not to forget Emily or the memories they had shared, but to honor them by living a life that embraced the present, one that allowed for new connections, new love, and new beginnings. As the sun began to set over the city, Claire and Lila made their way back to the apartment. The evening sky was painted with hues of pink and gold, much like the sunset they had watched together at the cabin. Claire glanced at Lila, feeling a surge of affection for this young woman who had brought so much light back into her life. When they reached the apartment, Claire paused at the door, her hand resting on the doorknob. Lila, she said softly, turning to face her. I just want you to know, you've given me something I didn't think I could have again. Lila looked at her, her expression warm and understanding. What's that? Hope, Claire replied, her voice steady. You've given me hope. Lila smiled, her eyes softening with emotion. You've given me the same. As they stepped inside, Claire glanced at the silver bracelet on her wrist, the bracelet that had once been a symbol of loss, now transformed into something new. It was no longer just a reminder of the past, but a symbol of the future, a future that she and Lila would face together, with the memory of Emily guiding them, not as a ghost of what was lost, but as a gentle force that had brought them to this moment. The door closed behind them, and as the evening settled in, Claire felt a deep sense of peace. The journey hadn't been easy, and there were still challenges ahead, but for the first time in years, she wasn't afraid. She wasn't alone. She had found family again, and with it, she had found herself. Months later, Claire stood in the gallery, watching as visitors admired Lila's latest photography exhibition. The room was filled with images that captured the beauty of memory and the complexity of loss, each photograph telling a story of its own. Lila's work had evolved into something extraordinary, and Claire couldn't help but feel a swell of pride as she watched her navigate this new chapter of her life. One photograph in particular caught Claire's attention, a black and white image of two hands, clasped together, one wearing a delicate silver bracelet. It was a simple shot, but it held so much meaning. It was their story, captured in a single frame. As Claire stood there, watching the world move around her, she felt an overwhelming sense of fulfillment. The journey had been long, and the pain of losing Emily would never fully fade, but now it was woven into something greater, something hopeful. And as the night went on, Claire smiled, knowing that this was just the beginning.